evening, everyone. We are getting a little late start. I'm actually in the waiting room of a doctor's office where we came for a survivor to be seen, and it was really important to keep this appointment. So we're just joining you in a new way today. So thanks everyone for joining. It's a little bit more constrictive because I am only on my phone, so I can't see everyone all at once, but I welcome you to our monthly community meeting, Awareness to Action. Appreciate Loretta on the administrative end helping with all of the logistics. Welcome to our guest speaker. Welcome to some people that have some special announcements to share. But we would like to start with a short video. I know all of you, I'm sure, have been impacted by COVID, either having been sick yourself or someone you know having been sick, and perhaps even having lost someone. We lost a wonderful volunteer, Jamie Pruill. She began volunteering for the coalition in October of 2019. She was a dedicated volunteer driver, cared very much about different aspects of the survivors, not just giving rides, but their interest in education and opportunities and resources that she shared with them because of her background. She was also a host, volunteer host for survivors who needed emergency shelter, and opened her home up, which was a beautiful and welcoming and warm home for them. And we lost her to COVID on December 26th of 2021. This was a video that Jamie taped for a submission that we made for a foundation. But it's a lovely representation of who she was and how she cared about the work she did with the coalition.
Hi, I'm Jamie Pruill, and I'm a volunteer with the Stop Human Trafficking Coalition of Central Missouri. As a volunteer, I've developed relationships with some of the survivors through, spending time in the car with them and just talking life in general. And it does matter. It is a meaningful volunteer position. Probably the most meaningful that I've had in a long time. There are a couple of success stories I would like to talk about the survivors. One, I've seen her go from living in a hotel to living in a house. She has a job. It seems like her life is on a forward motion where things are getting better for her all the time. I've seen changes. She seems to be more trusting. This particular one that I'm talking about now, her children seem very well, very settled, and very kind. So I believe that that's a reflection of the growth that she's made through, or along with the help that the coalition has given her.
I remember Jamie and the generosity of her spirit and care for who the coalition was and the survivors that we served. We'd like to share good news. We had an 80s prom fundraiser hosted by at Level Up by Nick Parker and the folks that work with him. If you've not been there at the mall, it's a great venue, great family place with lots of fun things to do. And it was last Friday night. We just wanted to share that there was $6,425 raised for the coalition to help us help survivors. So just thank you for all of you who may be on the call with us, who came out and enjoyed the prom night. All right, thank you so much. I hope Adonica is on the call with us. Are you with us with your daughter?
I am actually with us with my daughter, Cameron.
Hi, I'm Cameron.
Who's
Hi.
a sophomore at Rockbridge in the City
Hi,
Light Show
Cameron.
Choir. And Morgan.
Hi, I'm Morgan.
Wonderful.
And they're both show choir ladies at the Rockbridge High School. And I wanted to let you guys know that every year Rockbridge High School Show Choir does a benefit concert. And this year they chose you guys' coalition as the beneficiaries of the benefit concert. So that concert will be Tuesday, February 22nd at Rockbridge High School, and Battle Show Choir will also be there. And we will sell the tickets and we will take a collection, and all the proceeds will go to benefit the Stop Human Trafficking Coalition. So we would love to invite anyone out. Nanette has the flyer that's able to be shared. And so we are going to raise as much money as we possibly can for you guys' coalition.
Thank you so much. And do we have on our flyer about where to buy tickets? I
You
remember
know-
seeing something online.
You know what?
I-
It is on there. The website is on
Oh,
there. So yes,
wonderful.
it's on the flyer.
Okay, wonderful. So I think I found the link to buying tickets, and I think they're just $5. So there's really no excuse not to be able to come. And I know, listen to some wonderful music performances. I looked at some of the articles and pictures of performances that they have all done in the past, and it just looks like a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
You are so welcome. We look forward to welcoming anybody who can come that night. And we'd love to have representatives there to accept the donation at the end of the night.
Absolutely. We look forward to being there. We actually, just so you know, we changed the date of a training we were doing to make sure we could be there. It's like, no way are we going to miss this. So yeah,
That's
thank
awesome.
you.
That's awesome.
All
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Bye, girls. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
All right. Happy Chinese New Year, everyone. I just think that we have to be mindful of all the positive things going on in our world. It's time of challenge, and the Chinese Lunar Year began February 1st. Hopefully you all had maybe a bowl of noodles for good luck. But why I wanted to share is just because of the tiger. It is the year of the tiger. And as you know, the Mizzou tiger is really important to those of us here in the Columbia area and who are Mizzou fans or alums. But also the tiger stands for strength, power, courage, and ambition. This is an animal that represents a symbolic release of fears and standing for truth, justice, and integrity. And I just thought it was a great message for all of us as part of our meeting. The lunar year can also symbolize resilience and strength, with this being the year of the tiger. And certainly those are both needed as we continue to face the challenges and struggles of another year of COVID and many other challenges that we face, including what we're addressing today, such as racism. So going to the next slide. So we wanted to do our part in recognizing this is certainly an issue that impacts human trafficking. There's a great deal of scholarly articles and other types of information that you can find to understand this. This is a very big issue, but we're just going to take a small bite tonight with the help of our guest speaker, Yvette Young. But each one of these topics in and of themselves are very complex and very deep, but we did want to begin to address it collectively through one of our community meetings. So going to the next slide, we also are hosting one of our Human Trafficking 101 sessions on February 24th this month, and wanted to share that it's free and that will be in person and via Zoom. And so you can see on the slide the information to RSVP. It's our usual coalition Gmail address, and we welcome you to sign up for that. And we are covering the basics of this form of human exploitation called human trafficking. We wanted to share one of the slides. Sorry, Loretta, this racial disparity slide, if that's there if you've got that one. That's just sharing one of the slides that we present in our 2-hour Human Trafficking 101 to give you an idea that we do highlight this on one of the slides. And if you want to just take a look at some of the statistics that we cite on this one slide. Of course, it is only one slide, but we felt it was important to have it represented in the full presentation because it certainly has an impact in this crime and the victims who are impacted. So take a look at some of the statistics. And I know that Yvette will be delving further, but we wanted to share with you one of the slides that we share in our Human Trafficking 101. So going back to the Black History Month. So this is all part of what we want to do. And of course, every day, every month, we should be cognizant of the diversity in our communities, the challenges that exist across different ethnicities, races, cultures, genders, ages, and backgrounds, socioeconomic, educational. And we know that these diversities certainly impact who becomes a victim, who is at risk, who is targeted. And certainly people of color, in recognition of Black History Month, we want to acknowledge that there is something important in the link between this being Black History Month and the impact of people of color in human trafficking. So just a quick quote from the presidential proclamation for Black History Month. It is essential that we take time to celebrate the immeasurable contributions of Black Americans, honor the legacies and achievements of generations past, reckon with centuries of injustice, and confront those injustices that still fester today. And then also in line with that, a quote from July 1, 2020 McCain Institute piece that was written: through commercial sex or forced labor, exploitation affects the most vulnerable, specifically Black, Indigenous, and other peoples of color. So this is an important topic, and I'm excited to have Yvette Young share with us. If we could just take a few minutes though, what we usually do is get an idea of who's on the Zoom call and let you all introduce each other. We do believe that networking during these monthly meetings are an important part of staying connected, of staying strong in this effort to fight human trafficking, to be familiar with each other and the resources that we all have to offer. Maybe Loretta, if you're able to see the full screen, if you could help me out with letting people introduce themselves from what you're seeing on this big screen.
Sure. If Laura, if you want to start introducing yourself for us. Oh, you'll need to unmute, Laura.
You're right. Sorry. Okay, I'm Laura Cooley. I live in the Hope Summit, New Bloomfield area out in the country, and I've been a volunteer for driving people where they need to go.
Thank you. Yvette, we'll come back to you since you're our guest speaker and have you go last. Christine's iPad, would you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, I'm Christine Gansimer. I'm a past board member of Lake of the Ozarks Stop Human Trafficking Coalition.
Thank you, Christine. Katie Miller, if you're would like to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Katie Miller and I'm from Trenton, Missouri. I work for Green Hills Community Action Agency.
Thank you.
And Katie, sorry to interrupt, but Katie, would you share the announcement about the Human Trafficking Symposium that is being hosted there in Trenton? If you could do that briefly.
Yeah, so we're hosting a human trafficking symposium. It's going to be March 1st, and we're going to have several guest speakers. I can send, once we get the brochure next week, I can send it to you, and anybody that's in this group, if they would like to come to it, just let us know, and I will send it to you. And then if you want to forward it on, you guys are more than welcome to come. It's a free event. There'll be lots of people in our area that'll be there. A meal will be provided, but the more the merrier. We're
Yes.
just trying to get the word about human trafficking and everything, because it's kind of, there's not a lot of awareness around our area.
And I appreciate the initiative that you all have taken. I would say starting with the introduction of a survivor that we referred there for services, and you all have been serving him so well, and excited to hear that he's at a place where he wants to share his story as a survivor of trafficking as part of the symposium, which, by the way, is from 9 to 3. And as she said, includes a meal. So thank you so much, Katie.
No problem.
Then Audrey, would you introduce yourself, please?
Good evening, everybody. I'm Audrey Kaufman. I'm in Jefferson City. I started as a volunteer and I'm now the board chair.
Thank you, Audrey. Crystal Bennett, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, good evening. My name is Crystal Bennett. I'm a survivor of trafficking and executive director of an anti-trafficking organization called the Lantern Project.
Thank you.
And where are you, Crystal?
So I'm actually, I reside in Leavenworth. However, our organization is nationwide.
Wonderful to have you. Thanks for joining us. How did you hear about the coalition in our meeting tonight?
So I've actually done quite a bit of work in providing workshops and presentations throughout the state of Missouri for the Department of Children and Families.
Thank you. Great to have you connected with us as well.
Thank you.
All right, Rochelle.
Hi, my name is Rochelle Douglas, and I am from Hallsville, Missouri, so just north of Columbia. And I'm a board member and co-chair of the Education and Outreach Committee for the Stop Human Trafficking Coalition, and as well as volunteer. But can I also address the Earn It Act, that bit
Yes.
of legislation?
Yes, and Loretta, if you can, I'm sorry, we did talk about that slide in the very beginning, talking about the meeting. If you have anything to put up, that would be great. Thank
Oh,
you. Yes.
did you already talk about it?
No, we didn't, but
Oh.
we meant to. So please go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. So the Earn It Act is legislation that's trying to get passed right now. It's going to be coming up. Basically, we're waiting for Congress to, I guess, approve it. I don't really know how all the legislation type stuff works, but this is a really big deal. It's something that's been in the works for years. NCOSE, the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, has been pushing for this legislation along with a bunch of other organizations. And if you've heard about the whistleblower with Facebook and all the hearings that have been going on between YouTube and Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat and all that this all kind of brings all that to, I don't know what I'm trying to say, but basically there's 4 main points from the Earn It Act. It removes immunity for social media and technology companies that knowingly facilitate the distribution of CSAM, which is child sexual abuse material, otherwise known as child pornography. And it, which on that same note, it updates the existing federal statutes to replace child pornography with a more accurate term of child sexual abuse material. And then it gives victims a path to justice and establishes a commission of survivors, technology reps, privacy and civil rights experts, and other stakeholders to recommend best practices for tech companies to respond to astronomical increase in online sexual exploitation of children, including grooming for sex trafficking. So it's a big deal. It's a big deal. And basically NCOSE has it set up. It's super duper easy. You can go to their website. And I don't know if Loretta, if you put the link in the chat, or I can put it in the chat, but you just click on the link and it'll take you straight to the Earn It Act. And all you have to do is take less than a few minutes to fill the information out, and they will forward on a letter to our state congressmen, legislators, I cannot talk, and representatives, so that urging them to co-sponsor and support the Earn It Act. So it's a big deal. So the more people that we can have sign that and send that through, the better chances we have to get this thing to push on through. So.
Great. Thanks so much, Rochelle. And yeah, at the end of the presentation, I will send out links for tickets if you'd like to go to the Rockbridge Show Choir benefit concert, and a link to the information about the Earn It Act and how they make it really easy to reach out to your legislators and let them know your thoughts on that, as well as educate yourself on the Earn It Act.
Yes. Thank you, Loretta.
Sean, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. My name is Sean Debris. I'm a new supporter and a governmental affairs professional that lives in Jefferson City.
Thanks so much for joining us, Sean. Leela, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Leela Jishnani, and I'm advisory board member. Try to help out in whatever manner I can.
Thank you. Leela's been a long time supporter of the coalition. We are so grateful for you, Leela. Tim, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, it's Denise Hockey, but I'm using Tim's computer tonight.
Okay.
I'm a volunteer in Jefferson City.
Hi, Denise. Glad to have you with us. Denise is one of our new volunteers, and is, if I can share, Denise has volunteered to kind of head up a program that the coalition will be doing where at Valentine's Day, we always send out notes and letters of encouragement to the survivors in our program, and Denise is going to be doing that for us this year. In addition, Denise is also going to send out birthday cards to all of our survivors in our program. So Denise, thank you so much for volunteering to do that. We're just so grateful to have you with us.
You're welcome.
And Jessica, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Jessica, and I'm a victim advocate at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri.
Great to have you with us, Jessica. And Angela, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Angela, and I am a member of the PAC, People Against Child Trafficking, out of Eldon, Missouri. And we're kind of a sub-group of the Stop Human Trafficking Coalition of the Lake of the Ozarks.
Angela, would you like to share about the, I don't want to call it a benefit, but the event you folks are hosting?
Yeah, I thank you for bringing that up, Angela. The Hope Road from Victim to Survivor documentary event. Would you talk about that?
I don't have all the information on that, but we do have one, and I have it in my email, but I don't know all the information. But I have watched that documentary before, and I do know that it is very enlightening. We posted it at my church before, so I know, but they're hosting it not at our church, it's somewhere else, but I can get the flyer for where that's going to be. It is something that I think teenagers should watch if their parents think that it's appropriate, but my kids have seen it. They're 17 and 24, but I think it's something that kids just don't know that's going on, and then they end up so far into something that they don't really see it coming. So having that stuff and knowing that those people are out there looking for them, and how people are drawn into trafficking makes them kind of open their eyes and be a little bit more cautious, especially in their teenage years, because girls just, like, it's not something that I would have ever known whenever I was young to watch out for. And I make sure that my kids know the stuff that, could happen, and you just don't even know. But I will definitely get the flyer and make sure that we get it put in the links or get it sent out to the people that we have. And we also have in May a 5K. It'll be our second annual 5K event, and all the money, all the proceeds will go to the Stop Human Trafficking Coalition as well. I think last year we gave half to Columbia and then half to the lake. So, and that was over 5,000. I think we raised last year. So we're really excited about that as well.
Thank you, Angela. Loretta, I did send a flyer if we have a chance to grab that, but it is on March 24th. Tickets are $10 and it starts at 5:30 at the Eldon School of Performing, or sorry, the Eldon High School Performing Arts Center. And Hope Road is a documentary about child sex trafficking. And it's in partnership with the Lake of the Ozarks Stop Human Trafficking Coalition, the Stop Human Trafficking Coalition of Central Missouri, and Citizens Against Domestic Violence, Inc. I especially appreciate Citizens Against Domestic Violence, Inc., CADV for short, located in Camdenton. They serve that whole lake area. They're a domestic violence shelter, and they have been helping to organize this and bring this into the community to help the two coalitions serving the area. It is a documentary that the coalition has a special connection to, because one of the survivors that we have served and still have contact with is featured in the documentary. So we welcome anyone who's in the area would like to travel there. Thanks, Angela.
All right, I believe, is there anyone we missed? Oh, no, we've got Christine. I believe that's everyone, Nanette.
Okay, thank you. So Yvette, I would like to introduce Yvette Young. For those of you who've been receiving the email from the coalition about today's meeting and our speaker, or who have found us on Facebook, we have shared, Yvette, your full bio, but I would like to highlight and just share when I knew that it was an important time to lift up this issue of race, racism, and human trafficking. It's important every day, but taking advantage of highlighting Black History Month and highlighting this issue for all of us in this anti-trafficking work. I started researching, Google searching, and found your video, Yvette, with you and two other anti-trafficking advocates on StoryCorps. And Loretta, we can share that in an email follow-up, but also can get it posted to our Facebook. But it's really a great conversation among these three anti-trafficking advocates about race and human trafficking. And so I sent her what you might call a cold call, only it was a cold email. And she replied to me within a minute. And I was just so pleased that she was available and willing to share from her expertise. A few highlights. She has 22 years of experience working for nonprofit organizations as leader, director, trainer, advocate, and clinician. She's currently working as the Associate Vice President of Programs and Advocacy at the Villages for Families and Children. She's been part of a human anti-trafficking response team. She has provided leadership for the Governor's Task Force on Justice for Abused Children, and also leadership oversight for the Juvenile Review Board and for residential programs at the Village. She's a member of the CT Advisory Council for Victims of Crime and Trafficking in Person Council. Actually, everything is a highlight, Yvette. I was trying to highlight, but everything you've done is really tremendous work. But especially tonight, appreciating not only your background in justice issues and anti-trafficking work, but also your expertise related to racial justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And also there must be a TEDx video out there of you. I have not watched that, but certainly all of us can look for it. So Yvette, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to what you can bring to enlighten us and to hopefully encourage us to move forward in our work and take action with a new kind of understanding and knowledge about race, racism, and human trafficking. Thank you, Yvette.
Thank you, and I really appreciate you reaching out and asking me to do this. You know, racial justice issues are definitely a passion area of mine, and also human trafficking. So merging the two has really been very eye-opening for me. I started working on this curriculum in 2020 or 2019. I started this work around really elevating race and trafficking probably around 2017 or so. So it's been a journey to kind of elevate this conversation. So the more requests like this I get, the more excited I get, because that means that people are starting to pay attention and want to learn more about this intersection. So I really appreciate the opportunity to share just a small bit of, so just so everyone in the audience know, I developed a presentation. At this point, I keep working on it, changing it, fixing it, taking it, tweaking it. I did some more adjustments this year. It's probably close to a 2-hour presentation at this point, but because of the time that I had tonight, I pulled some slides and will probably present for about 30 minutes or so, and then open up for any questions that folks have. So with that said, let me pull up my PowerPoint and get started. Can everyone see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, so with that said, so to begin with, in doing this, doing my research in this area, one of the things that I realize is an important part of the discussion is not just to share about just race, the statistics about human trafficking, but it's important to have a conversation about the historical context and the actions that have happened and experiences that have occurred in the United States that has resulted in the level of human trafficking and exploitation we see, and especially for people of color. In my full presentation, I do sort of a historical review, looking at American slavery, looking at looking at Native culture and the colonization process that impacted them. But because it's in interest of time, I'm not covering that tonight. But I wanted to start the presentation with this quote, which I think is very informative around this idea of how history has impacted what we're looking at in current day. So this is from the U.S. Department of State, the Office to Combat Trafficking in Person. The United States and other governments face human trafficking challenges and trends today that reflect the living legacy of the systemic racism and colonization globalized during the transatlantic slave trade through chattel slavery and regional practices of indigenous disposition, and the centuries-long racial campaigns of violence, fear, and trauma that followed. So I want you to keep that in mind, that the historical context of the United States, which is built on human trafficking, has led to a lot of what we're going to see in current day. And I'll share current statistic. We'll talk a little bit more in depth about the intersection of race and human trafficking, but wanted to really frame that historical context for you. I'm sure all of you on this call are fully aware of the federal definition of human trafficking, but I always like to review the definition in any presentation I do, because I want us to all have sort of a common understanding of what we mean when we say human trafficking. So the trafficking definition from the Trafficking Victims Protection Act states that human trafficking is a recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for 2 reasons: sex trafficking or labor trafficking. For sex trafficking, it's a commercial sex act for anything of value through the use of force, fraud, and coercion. In the case of sex trafficking federally, you do not have to prove force, fraud, or coercion for individuals under the age of 18. So for minors, if there's an exchange of a sex act for anything of value, it is considered human trafficking. On the labor side, you do have to prove force, fraud, or coercion for both children and adults. And when we're talking about labor trafficking, we're talking about involuntary servitude, debt bondage, slavery, etc. A lot of the work that I've done around human trafficking, a lot of the data we see is usually geared towards sex trafficking, especially for minors. The work that I did through HEART was with children, and we would see more cases of sex trafficking than we did on the labor side. But in the work that I've done since that grant, I see that we have a lot of cases on the labor side where adults are concerned. So definitely an issue that impacts both children and both genders. So in summary, this is a quote actually from Polaris, which I thought was a brilliant summation of what human trafficking is. And the quote is, human trafficking is the business of stealing freedom for profit. And I don't think there's a better way to frame that definition than that quote. So we're going to dive in and talk a little bit about the intersection where race is concerned. So one of the things I wanted to highlight is that there's a lot of race-based myths about human trafficking. We don't talk enough about them. We don't highlight them, but it is important for us to have these conversations because dismantling myths is a way for us to really truly get to the core of what the issues are and know what we need to work on. So the first one is the majority of victims are young white girls and women. And that has been a narrative you see through media. You Google human trafficking, beyond the people in chains, which is typically that whole bondage look that you see, which is not how all trafficking victims are treated. But the images that you see are white women or white girls predominantly. There's not too many imagery. You see movies and it's the same sort of depiction. So it is a myth because the reality is that 77% of victims in alleged human trafficking incidents reported in the United States are people of color. 77%. So I always make this disclaimer because I know that, this conversation can sometimes, get a little bit heavy. Not only are we talking about human trafficking and the victimization of humans, but now we're really shedding a light on the issue of race and the fact that there is a group of individuals in our society that are being victimized at a higher rate than their counterparts. I say this disclaimer to say that does not mean that white individuals are not being trafficked or victimized. They are. But when you think about the BIPOC community, which is Black, Indigenous, people of color, they are the highest percentage of victims that are being trafficked. So the notion that it is white women and girls is definitely a myth. Majority of traffickers are Black men. We see oftentimes the glorification of pimp culture. You see Black men with the hats on, with the feather and the flashy suits and the jewelry and the Cadillac and all the women around them, etc. Like in media, that's one of the representation we often see. And the actual reality is that anyone could be a trafficker. Racial identity does not matter. Ethnic identity does not matter. Age does not matter. So we need to start to allow people to understand that that perception of who the trafficker is making us miss, or many people miss, the folks that are trafficking that don't fit into that stereotype. So that myth we have to sort of dismantle, and it is driven by race because there's this concept that Black men are criminals or Black men are trying to victimize white women, which is where a lot of this language around trafficking sort of began. And so we do have to start to dismantle that and allow folks to realize that there is a spectrum of individuals who are trafficking, both our children and our adults. White children are kidnapped and sold into foreign countries. And this myth really, I think, is driven by the movie Taken. You hear a lot of people sort of leverage that movie as where they've kind of gotten that concept that this is an issue that happens in foreign countries and not necessarily here in the United States. And that obviously is a myth because we do have individuals in our own country that is being trafficked. So the last one, which ties into the previous one, is human trafficking victims are foreign-born individuals and those who are poor. And when I came into the movement, that notion that this was an international issue, that this was something that, was happening abroad and people were, children and adults were getting victimized in other countries, was a part of my consciousness until I got educated and trained and started to look at the data in Connecticut and realized, no, this is an issue that is happening right here in the United States, children who are born here in the United States, who are citizen, adults who are born here, citizens of the United States, are trafficking victims. And so that it was important to shift that narrative, because when you're thinking about the other or that other place, we don't take enough time to look at what's happening in our own backyards. And often when I do these presentations, I say human trafficking is a backyard issue. And if you don't realize that, then the reality is you're missing the victims that exist within your own community. And then the issue of poverty. Poverty is definitely a vulnerability factor. We'll talk a little bit about that later in the presentation. But we also cannot miss the fact that there are individuals from affluent communities that are also trafficked as well. And so we really do need to have this broad lens around the fact that, you know, anybody potentially could be a victim of trafficking. But yet again, when there's a racial lens in it that skews our thinking, it is important for us to dismantle that piece so we could really truly address the issues that are in front of us. So this is a slide that a good visual representation of that 77% statistic that I shared with you in the previous slide. And so this breaks it down. The top row are white individuals. Then you have your Black individuals, which you see is a predominant group of individuals being exploited in the United States. Then you have your Asian group, which is a smaller representation. Then you look at your Hispanic population, which is also pretty comparable, I think, to a little bit more than white communities. And then the other, which they didn't really specify clearly what the other category really consisted of. But when you take a look at the visual of this, you can see that the predominant group of individuals being trafficked in the United States are people of color. Can't miss that. You can't get confused about that. The statistic is the statistic. The fact is the fact. One of the things that's startling for me, though, when I pulled this slide together and started to do these presentation, was a lack of inclusivity. There's one population group of individuals that is not represented on this image, and that are victims of trafficking at a high volume as well, and that is the Native community. And so a part of me goes, wow, how do you miss such a critical group of individuals when you are capturing data for the United States? And the reality is that they are victims, and they're victims historically, and they're victims currently, but they're not even represented in our data around race. So I want to highlight that and say that we definitely have work to do around inclusivity when we're capturing data and really being able to examine the individuals who are being victimized. And I don't want to make the assumption that they fall in the other group, because that does not make any sense to me. Some other statistic based on this slide is that there's a higher representation of Black people on the sex trafficking side of the data. And then when you look at the labor side, there's a higher representation of Hispanic and Asian populations. Hispanic population have the highest on the labor side. So here's some more statistics to just sort of blow your mind a bit, because when I read them, I was blown out the water. When we talk about disparities, and there was a slide I believe Nanette shared in the beginning that talked about racial disparities in this work and the issues that come up. It's really startling when you think about the percentage Black, Asian, Hispanic, Native populations sort of makeup of the United States versus when you look at the number of victims that come from those very small population. So I have a few of those in this slide, but in general, that disparity is very evident across all these particular racial groups. So in Louisiana, Black girls account for nearly 40% of the child trafficking victims, though Black girls comprise approximately 19% of Louisiana's youth population. So small percentage as far as representation, but a high representation on the sex trafficking side. King County, Washington, 84% of their child sex trafficking victims are Black, while Black children and adults, so let me emphasize that, not just the kids, but the Black children and adults only comprise 7% of the general population of King County, but they account for 84% of the victims. I have a little bit more detail on this particular statistic because when I was doing HEART, we used to have grantee meetings in DC and all of the representatives would show up and we would talk about the work that we're doing. The woman that was working on this work in King County shared this statistic in that meeting, and it's also been published in other literature. But when she shared the statistic, she also, which blew me away, and actually, to be honest with you, was where my sort of the wheel started turning in my head, and I was like, no, we can't, this cannot be our reality, and we're not talking about this, and we're not doing anything about it. And that's what really sparked me to come back to Connecticut and start a movement around, you know, elevating this issue of race and human trafficking. But when she shared the statistics, she also shared the fact that a lot of the buyers, if not the majority of the buyers, were white men. And that I believe she said someone or multiple buyers would state they would rather purchase a Black girl than a white girl because they did not want who they were having sex with. And yet again, we're talking about minor children here, to look like their daughters, right? So let that soak in for you. I can victimize a Black child, but I cannot victimize a white child, because that white child will remind me of my own child, and I wouldn't be able to do that. So that's why that 84% is so high, because those are the individuals, those are the children that they're seeking in that county. Similarly, we have strong evidence from the U.S. National Human Trafficking Hotline that Latinos are disproportionately represented among human trafficking victims and survivors in general, and predominantly, as I said earlier, on the labor trafficking side. And the Bureau of Justice Statistics stated 63% of trafficking victims are Latin, 63%. The Bureau of Justice Statistics also reports that 17% of human trafficking victims in the United States are Asian. And as you see these numbers, it start to make more sense as far as the graph that I showed you earlier, the image I showed you earlier. And the last piece of statistic around the BIPOC community, and I'm gonna be honest, I had to search for this information because, as I said, the data that I saw for United States did not include the Native population. So I had to go do my own research to find other articles and other information or other literature that quoted statistics for that population. And when I was able to do that, the National Conference of American Indians found that an estimated 40% of women who are victims of sex trafficking identify as American Indian, Alaska Native, or First Nation, right? So here is a high percentage of victimization happening in this community, but yet again, they're not represented in the national data. So let's go into systemic racism, hot button topic. So I'm going to define it for you, and then we'll take a look at the intersection between systemic racism and trafficking. So this quote states, "The structures and systems in our country benefit those with power, position, and privilege." Period, end discussion. It has historically been that way, and it still is that way. Systemic racism means that the policies, practices, and social norms of our society intentionally exclude and harm minority groups. More often than not, the struggle of people of color is pushed under the radar and out of the public's view. Black and minority lives are made invisible by the segregation of cities, brutal over-policing, and overt and implicit racism. And we saw a lot of this surface when we had the George Floyd movement, and people were enraged by watching this man lose his life. That did not have to happen. And it sparked something inside of our nation, not just the BIPOC community, but our entire nation, that as a country, we need to do better. And we need to start to dismantle and end these systems that have caused this level of pain and oppression in these communities. And we got a lot of work to still do. Despite all the protests and everything that happened, there's still a lot of work that we have to do. So when we look at the intersection of systemic racism and human trafficking, here's some statistics that I found, and we'll talk a little bit further about it on the next slide. But 40% of US sex trafficking victims are Black, which I mentioned earlier. The average white household has 10 times more wealth than the average Black home. And I'll dive into that deeper when I talk about factors, because wealth is a factor. The FBI reported, and I think Nanette shared this in her slide, that 57.5% of all juvenile prostitution arrests are Black children. 57.5%, and they account for such a small population in our nation. Out of 100 cases, 78% of the victims themselves were arrested, while 22% of the time the buyer was arrested. And if we really want to break this down further, that 78% that is being arrested are people of color. And that 22% that they're accounted for, which means 80 or 78% of the buyers are getting away, are Caucasian. And so when you talk about this racial tension and this divide, here we go again, you have the victims being penalized for their victimization and punished for their victimization. And then those who are doing the victimization and abuse are getting away with it. And when you look at the racial dynamics, it plays out like it was back in the historical context of slavery and oppression and colonization. So contributing factors related to systemic racism, I mentioned the lower economic status for individuals, and the Black-white wealth gap, as I said, was 10 times greater in white household for wealth. And we have a history of barriers to attainment of wealth for people of color. Do your research, you'll see so many. You had redlining, you had loans not being offered. You have a group of individuals, especially when you think about Black individuals, started in slavery, had no opportunity to necessarily, not everyone, because there are Black folks that do have wealth, but initially, you know, had no way of accruing wealth or had the opportunity to build up generational wealth. And so all those dynamics plays a role. And one study articulated that the social economic status is one of the top contributors in increasing the chance of sex trafficking. So socioeconomic status is a leading cause or one of the biggest contributors to why someone may be exploited through sex trafficking. So that lower socioeconomic status, which sometimes have resulted from systemic racism, is having an impact on victimization. The abuse to prison pipeline and the justice system. That's the first time when I was doing research, I heard about the abuse to prison. I know about the school to prison pipeline and some other versions, but the abuse one was very informative. And what it stated was that you have the majority of the women who are being arrested for sex trafficking cases are Black women. That Black women account for double the population of women in prison compared to their white counterpart. You also have the statistic we just shared about the 57.5% of Black girls being arrested for prostitution. So you have the Black girls, young children who are being arrested. The juvenile justice system has been set up to continue to oppress communities of color, and the data is there to confirm that, because you have a high percentage of Black males that are in prison in comparison to their counterparts. So a major issue that needs to be, you know, dealt with. And the fact that, you know, yet again, someone has been abused, has gone through a very violent situation, and then now being held accountable for their own victimization. And so that in itself, we have to change that from a systems point of view. And the other piece that people don't talk enough about is when you do arrest these women and they do end up with criminal records, it limits their opportunity for work, for housing, and for social benefits, leaving women unprotected and often homeless. So yet again, the system is against them. The adultification and sexualization of Black girls, and we see this a lot. One research study really stated that Black girls are viewed as less innocent and more adult-like than their counterparts. And so when you sexualize and adultify an individual, then it justifies their abuse and victimization. You have law enforcement that has arrested young Black girls as if that they're committing a crime versus respecting and honoring the fact that they are being victimized by adult men. So yet again, that concept and notion that they're tougher, they're independent, they're women-like, they don't need protection, that sort of mindset has definitely led to more victimization in the Black community, and especially for Black girls. We all know racial bias and stereotypes impact decision-making and actions. Implicit bias trainings are so important because it's about really constantly thinking about what are the messages that I'm using to sort of filter information. What am I processing when I'm looking at someone from a different race? What decisions am I making if I am in a position of power around that? If I'm a white male and I want to buy someone for sex, how am I filtering that I don't want to buy a white child, so I'm going to have to find a person of color, a child of color to victimize? Those are all dynamics that are, you know, sort of ingrained in the DNA of our country and is manifesting in the victimization of people of color. Separation policies that weakens family and community connection, just like in the times of slavery where families were dismantled and separated. We see the same thing happening in our system, our child welfare system. We see that happening a lot. When you take away that community support, that familial support, you create even more vulnerability for those children, and traffickers are fully aware of that and will take advantage of it. So definitely another area where systemic racism is rearing its head and having a massive impact on our communities. So this is a statistic, and actually this is a great report if anyone wants to take a look at it, but it was done by the Human Trafficking Legal Center in a partnership with Survivors Alliance. And I'm going to share a couple of the data points that they came out with from a survey they did. They did a survey with 87 women, and majority of those women were women of color. And so here's the statistics that came from that. So did racism make you more vulnerable to trafficking? And the resounding answer was yes. Of the 61% of women who said yes, 93% of them were women of color. And so yet again, you see the impact that racism is playing, and these are survivors sharing their experience and what they've been through. So this is not a generic piece of data or someone, sort of came up with this. These are individuals who have survived trafficking saying, yes, racism impacted the fact that it made me more vulnerable to be trafficked. So really making all of the information shared so far come to light. In that same survey or research study, another question, did racism make it more difficult for you to access services such as housing, case management, or legal representation? 45% responded yes. Of that 45%, 92% were BIPOC survivors. Did racism make it more difficult for you to access healthcare? 33% responding yes, and 90% of those individuals were BIPOC survivors. And the last one, did racism impact your ability to be a leader in the anti-trafficking movement? 45% responded yes, and 95% of that were BIPOC survivors. And we'll talk a little bit about representation as we go on. So why people of color? This has become, as I've added content to this presentation, has become a nice summary slide, because a lot of the information that I shared in the earlier part of the fuller presentation really then makes this slide make even more sense. So trends show that people of color are more likely to experience the following: a history of sexual and or physical abuse. And we all know in this movement that a history of physical and sexual abuse, emotional abuse makes victims more vulnerable to be trafficked. Community or family instability and dislocation, which I talked about, the separation of the family, losing, a support network and a system, creates vulnerability. Child welfare involvement, especially out of home foster care placement. Nationally, a lot of the dialogue is that children in foster care are the largest population being victimized, but in the state of Connecticut, we've also seen that kids living at home with a parent or guardian are high percentage for victimization as well. Life as a runaway or homeless youth. We all know that children who are runaway or even adults who are homeless are extremely vulnerable, and traffickers will prey on them to be able to provide for them so that they can get them to do what they want to do and to exploit them. So high-risk population and a large population are people of color. Disconnection from the education system and being off track for achievement. So there's a documentary called Push Out, which really focuses on Black girls being pushed out of the educational system. When you look at suspension data, when you look at expulsions, et cetera, the predominant group of individuals that are being pushed out of school are children of color. And so that then leads into the idea of the school to prison pipeline, where you have these children who are not receiving an education, that are in the community, don't have any resources, and traffickers will definitely take advantage of the fact that they have nowhere to go. They're not in school, they need money, or they need resources. They may be in an impoverished community. And so here we go, multiple vulnerabilities stacked upon each other, and they are taken advantage of. Poverty, I've already discussed, because I talked about the sort of wealth gap is a factor. Historical trauma and cultural loss. So as I said in my overall presentation, I look at slavery and colonization, and really demonstrate the trauma and the cultural loss that happened for those two communities, that then results into the vulnerability of their victimization in current time. And then, as I just discussed, systemic racism, all the dynamics and factors that was just discussed that has led to the vulnerability of people of color and therefore their victimization. So in summary, all these factors make them more vulnerable targets for human trafficking, period, end of discussion. So this was also another piece of information from the survey by the Legal Center. And the question was, do you think the anti-trafficking movement is doing enough to address racism? 14% said yes, but 67% said no. And of that 67%, 79% were people of color. This was a quote that a survivor shared from that survey, which really speaks to the idea of representation and having a voice at the table. White survivors, knowing that racism exists, could be more generous in decentering themselves so that BIPOC survivors can also have a seat at the table. They can also be advocate voices on behalf of BIPOC survivors with the larger anti-trafficking organizations who generally don't consider our voices. So we've seen the impact that racism have. We've seen the intersection of race and human trafficking. And so where I want to end this presentation is really looking at what do we do next, or what needs to happen? So after all the research I did, I pulled together a couple of bullet points that I thought really speaks to everything that I've sort of read in my research, what I was hearing from survivors, the quotes, et cetera, the data, all of it, that needs to be definitely considered and elevated in this movement. The first one is that it's important to educate yourself about the impact of systemic racism on human trafficking victims and survivors. If you don't understand that core concept, then you won't really understand the level of oppression and vulnerability that exists for the BIPOC community. Educate yourself about implicit bias and microaggressions. Maintain an anti-racist mindset. We have to do the work. It's not enough to say that I'm aware and conscious. We have to put the work in. We have to be able to educate ourselves constantly, do refreshers, continue to think through, force ourselves to consciously use a racial justice lens when we're doing the work and having the conversations, because that's how we're going to be able to transition into a place of change. If you run an organization, in an organization doing this work, it is important to develop policies that are inclusive and remove barriers for BIPOC victims and survivors. If you're advocating or you're an organization that specializes in that, or if you're just an individual who's really passionate about doing advocacy work, it is important to advocate for legislation. I saw you guys shared one that's coming up soon, but it is important to advocate for legislation that's going to protect and support human trafficking victims and survivors. In doing that advocacy, you are also in turn protecting a large population of BIPOC individuals. When applicable, provide professional and economic access and opportunities for survivors of human trafficking. There needs to be spaces for them to be able to have access to being able to inform this work. And some people are not saying that they're survivors, but they're survivors in the movement doing the work and informing it. But there are times that we need to make sure that we're being cognizant of, as I think in the bullet I missed before, ensuring that staffing and the board includes BIPOC individuals and human trafficking survivors if we truly want to understand this issue through their lens and help inform what our practices need to look like. And the last piece of recommendation is to be a good gatekeeper and allow equitable access to resources. I did an anti-racism training when I was way young, like early in my lifespan. And they really spoke a lot about gatekeepers and how there's many of us who have access to give access, and that some people are poor gatekeepers and they make decisions to exclude people and not give them access to the resources that they need. And that is important if you are truly an anti-racist and really, using a racial justice lens, that you're a good gatekeeper, which means you will give access to all that comes. And you will make sure that they know what resources are available to them and how to then access those resources and not make it difficult for them to be able to do that. So in this work, we all have to be good gatekeepers to ensure that all victims, no matter what their racial group is or their ethnic identity, receives the supports that they need. So I'm going to end on this slide. Representation matter, inclusion matter, equity matter, and BIPOC survivors matter. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing so that we have an opportunity to do questions.
Yvette, thank you so much. I know, like I said in the beginning, it was just kind of scratching the surface of very complex and difficult and deep areas that, as a person of color, I feel the same, that we don't spend enough time to talk about, to be familiar with language, and to understand the relevance in the work that we're doing. So thank you for taking time and bringing this message, and just want to open up to questions and comments as well. What's on your minds, folks? Having heard what you've heard tonight, and what questions would you have for Yvette?
I don't have any, oh, sorry.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I don't actually have any, at least not that I can think of just yet, but I just wanted to say thank you. The information was really great, eye-opening, disheartening, very disheartening. But I'm so glad for your voice and just what you're doing. So I appreciate you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I want to say that this is not an easy conversation. In general, race by itself is a difficult conversation to have. And when you merge the two and you're looking at victimization on both sides of this equation, right, it becomes even harder to digest and have that conversation and figure out sort of what do we do next and how do we move forward. And I think for me, you know, creating this presentation was to open the door to dialogue. We don't talk enough. One of the reasons why when I left DC that year, after looking at that statistic, the first thing that we did was I met with those two colleagues that Nanette mentioned that we did the StoryCorps. We met, and what we did was say, how are we going to get this messaging out there to the larger, you know, trafficking community? What can we do? How do we bring this to people's consciousness? And the first thing we did, our first effort, was an article that we wrote that was entitled, Let's Talk About Race and Human Trafficking. And the intent was to say, let's open a conversation, let's have a dialogue. We've been doing this work, and I sit on a major coalition, and it doesn't come up often enough. We don't talk about the fact that there is this massive intersection. We don't talk about the fact that the majority of the victims are people of color. Why? Why are we not having that conversation? Why is it so difficult? Why is it so uncomfortable? So a lot of this for me is just to open the door and to bring awareness to the fact that it is an issue, and it's okay for us to have a conversation about it without any shame or judgment attached to it, because that's the only way we are able to get to the other side of the equation. So I appreciate your feedback on that, and just say to anyone else, you know, feel free to share your thoughts, your frustrations, whatever, because this is where it begins.
Yeah, thank you. And just, it is just human trafficking in general is so disheartening. It just adds another huge layer to this that just makes me so angry.
Mm-hmm.
And specifically when you talked about, was it in Washington,
Mm-hmm.
You know, the white men buyers purchasing BIPOC, you know, children, just, oh, I'm sorry, that gets
Mm-hmm.
me. I have a heart for kids, just all kids, and that just you know, and I know that is true. I know that's
Mm-hmm.
true, but hearing somebody talk about it again, just yeah. So
It's a gut
thank you.
punch,
Thank you.
Joy.
And Yvette, I appreciate also, I would appreciate hearing your experience. One of the points on the slide that we use, just to touch on some of the racial disparities in human trafficking, was that traffickers preferred to exploit women and girls of color because they figured they would get, and it's true, their experience was they got in less trouble And when we share the slide, we say because of racism, that law enforcement, there are just point in fact, racial biases, and that law enforcement see people of color as lesser than, and traffickers take advantage of that attitude.
Yeah, and that's accurate. And one of the fundamental reasons why, as I said, when I talked about that statistic about the 70-something% are arrested are the victims, and then only 22% of the buyers, you can apply that same sort of concept to traffickers as well. And traffickers range racially, right? And so when you think about that, there is this messaging to victims that you don't have value or worth, or we don't care enough about you to prosecute the individuals who are victimized you. And we see that, in state statistic, the arrest rate, the prosecution rate for human trafficking is not high. We have a high volume of victims, but then we have a very low prosecution rate. So what does that tell you, and what message does that send to victims? So beyond even the racial dynamic, which is at play here, which is definitely contributing to, more arrests on the victim side, because as I said before, most of the victims are people of color, then you have this idea of sexual victimization. And if we want to dismantle that around how people view sex victims in general, because even on sexual assault side of the work, if there's no trafficking attached to it, those cases are not being prosecuted. Those victims are not being believed. Those individuals who are abusing them are getting away with the crime that they are committing. So then you now merge that mindset and cultural thinking, and you throw trafficking into it, and then you throw this racial dynamic into it. Of course, those individuals are going to get away with this crime because no one is holding them accountable, because they're saying that women don't have the value or important enough for us to spend the time and resources to prosecute those who are victimizing them. And that's why I said it gets even more compounded when you throw race in it, but that mindset and mentality has been there historically.
Yeah. It's like thinking about the bottom of the barrel. How do you get lower than the bottom of the barrel?
And so it's work. Sorry, go ahead. I think that was Audrey.
No, it's okay. Well, I was just going to add to that. One of your first slides, I think, talks a lot about why the buyers are not being prosecuted, and it's because of the position and the power that they hold, or their buddies hold, or that whole network takes the focus off of the buyer and tries to put it onto the victim. And I just want to tell you another slide that I took a picture of. I do some substitute teaching, and one of the slides that really caught my attention is because I'd like to see us get into the schools more, is why people of color, and then all of your characteristics. I see that every day that I walk into a public school, and I thought, well, maybe your words and me talking to administration with this slide will say, yes, that's true. Yes, we do need to address this. Yes, let's see what we can do.
And that's where it starts, right? As I said, it starts with the conversation, bringing the information to the consciousness of folks that opens the door for a dialogue around solution and strategies, and how do we protect? How do we keep these children safe? What else could we be doing that we're not doing because we're not prioritizing it as an issue? And we might not be prioritizing it as an issue because it is children of color.
Yes. Very good presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Laura, I think initially you were trying to get in. Did you have a comment or question?
Somehow I missed what the interpretation of what IPOC was. What does it exactly mean?
Oh, Black, Indigenous, People of Color.
Okay, got it. Okay, I knew I'd missed something
It's
there.
a new terminology, I think, within the last year or two, but it was a nice way of summarizing all people of color.
Yes, okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And thank you for your presentation. It was good.
Thank you.
And I just want to acknowledge, I'm sure other folks on the call are doing work in other ways that we may not know about. But Laura, for example, I know her through church, where our church has a diversity and inclusion committee. And I know Laura has been involved in that. And I know that as an institution of a church, trying to address that issue more collectively of a predominantly white congregation, isn't it, Laura?
Yes.
If it weren't for me and a couple other people, we would be all white, wouldn't we?
Crystal, you had a question or comment?
Yeah, I just, first and foremost, I just wanted to say thank you because I do a lot of the same, very similar presentations and spaces that I'm part of and talking about anti-trafficking prevention through an anti-racist, anti-oppressive lens. And a lot of the spaces that I'm part of, I find are really kind of steeped in like white saviorism and the mentality of needing to pull at the heartstrings in order to make people care. So I'm just curious to just kind of get a little insight from you as to your approach when working with audience that kind of have that mindset that's really harmful to the BIPOC community.
I think a part of the conversation is when you're a presenter, you don't always know your audience well. So you always have to respond based on the questions that you're getting and how people are framing their comments. And I think a part of that is I'm a big component of listening and hearing where someone's mindset is and then being able to help them rethink, right? Or taking the information that they just learned and reframe what they're thinking and saying so that it definitely honors the fact that yes, you want to be helpful, but the savior complex is not going to be received well by the communities that you're going into when people who look like you are the ones that are victimizing them. So the idea that, I'm going to swoop in and it's going to be all okay is not accurate because your own husbands or brothers or sons or whatever else is doing the victimization. And how do you own that reality and be able to have those conversations openly and honestly and transparently and authentically, that you own that truth, right? And so that you can then really meet people where they are. And you saw the survivor who said, I need white survivors to decentralize themselves so that there's space and room at the table. In the movement in general, it's predominantly a white movement. When you look at leadership in the anti-trafficking work, it's predominantly white women. And so if we're really going to do this work about really embracing communities of color, we do have to have better representation and more voices at the table that represent the victims that are in our community. So there's a way to have that conversation without blaming, victimizing, shaming, or doing any of the hard stuff that comes with doing this work, because it's a conversation. People are going through a place of learning and understanding and growing, and there has to be patience and grace that's given to that process. And I'm one of those individuals who will give grace and give people time to get where they ultimately need to. But I believe in the power of planting seeds. And so in one presentation, I may not get you, but the seed is planted, and then eventually as you have experiences and encounters, it'll start to grow for you.
Thank you, Yvette. And Crystal, because of the work that you do, I just wanted to give you time to share about your experience and the work you've done and things that you would share with us from your experience of presenting and your point of reference. We just welcome your comments, not just your questions, but your own comments.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Like I said, I'm a survivor of familial trafficking and currently serve as an executive director of the Lantern Project. So we do educational work in schools. We have a trafficking prevention for schools program. We also have a youth leadership board where we're preparing and centering the voices of our young people to do social advocacy work. We have a men's accountability program. So buyers of sex are referred to our program for a 10-week program around understanding gender socialization and the power imbalances between, of gender-based violence. And we also have a tech program that scrapes websites that obtains phone numbers from ads of people who are being sold for sex. So that way outreach can be done to connect individuals to services. But yeah, my frame of reference is, I always try to show up in spaces and really talk about the economic drivers and the disparities that exist. And it's not always received, and it's not, intended to be shame or to produce any guilt. It's about stating the facts and recognizing that justice and equity has to be at the center of our work to essentially allow for opportunity for everyone without, with people having the freedom to have the same opportunities without the power and privilege of having to potentially being exploited and trafficked. So thank you.
No, thank you. I know you're right that as Yvette had said, it's basically white representation in the movement and leaders and and all respect and appreciation for the many survivor leaders that who are out there. But just appreciate you being present, being represented in our meeting tonight, both you and Yvette, bringing your lived experience and perspective. And so if you wouldn't mind, please share your contact with me, with others, if you don't mind, in our chat box. Certainly would love to follow up with you. And Yvette also, Rochelle and I have already been texting back and forth about how we can bring your full presentation and host you some time to do that.
Okay.
And again, Crystal, we would love to connect with you, hearing about the programs you have with your youth, about the men accountability, about the tech program, all things that are very exciting to hear that you're doing. So thank you both, and all of you who've been on the call. More questions. We're still not mean to cut everybody off, but other questions or comments?
I just put up my contact
yes.
information because I
Thank
said
you,
I would
Yvette.
include it.
Yes, thank you. I also put in the chat box the link to your StoryCorps.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, so folks, remember, if you want to just be sure to cut and paste to save all the good things in the chat box, and plop it in a message to yourself or to your email or a note or whatever that you might have, whatever device that you're on. Please do save this information.
And just to do a plug, the TEDx talk that I did was on child trafficking. So if anyone's
Oh,
interested
yeah.
it's about 14 minutes long, but the focus was child trafficking for that one.
Yes, definitely going to search that as well. Thank you. And I just appreciate what you said in the background of the StoryCorps that you did was modeling the conversation. That's what I thought was so special about the discussion that you had with the three of you, representing male, female, person of color, people who are white, all of that diversity within the conversation that you had with each other. And so I would encourage people to take time to listen to that, because you modeled what a conversation can be like, which is what you're emphasizing, that we've got to start by having those conversations with one another.
Yeah. If folks have gotten this, I'm going to stop sharing because I know you guys are going to probably be wrapping. So let me stop sharing that. Does anyone else have one last burning question or comment that they would like to get in before we close? All right, well, just to say it was a pleasure being here. As I said before, I appreciate the invite and the opportunity to have this conversation and to bring this level of awareness to a group of individuals that are outside of the state of Connecticut. And I welcome any questions, any correspondence or anything post, because I really do believe that each one has to teach one and each one has to reach one. So we are a collective doing heavy work and hard work, and that we need a supportive network to be able to be successful. So I will always make myself available to be that part of that network.
Thank you. And I don't want to forget, let's see, am I muted or unmuted? I'm not muted. To recognize there is another person, Sean, if there's, from your lived experience, again, just wanting to take advantage of the representation we have, if there's anything that you would like to add or share out of your background and your experience in being part of this anti-trafficking work.
I'm new to anti-trafficking work, and so that's the reason why I'm so quiet. I want to take in as much as I can, but I am familiar with dealing with systems and people that are impacted by systems, and so I was very impressed by the presentation. That's the presentation and the information that she was giving, and also appreciated the way that she talks about handling dialogue. It's very difficult because when you're in any kind of advocacy work for a long time, you have to deal with the various intersections, especially with race. Sometimes you get tired of having conversations, but you have to, you have to be patient, and you have to try to make allies and not necessarily try to convert everybody in a day to where you think they need to be. So I appreciate the way she approaches things. So like I said, I'm here to learn. I want to help and volunteer where I can, because it's important work. So I thank you for the opportunity of speaking.
Yes. Sean, are you in the Mid-Missouri area?
I live in Jefferson City.
Okay.
Been doing governmental affairs work for about 15 years, mostly in healthcare and civil rights stuff. And so began shifting focus this past year. And so this is something I'm very interested in working on.
So Sean, I hope we'll be able to follow up with you as well, being in our area.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks again for the wonderful presentation.
Yes. And so I think I think all of the points made, it helps us understand that these monthly meetings are really critical time, whether you're new to human trafficking, whether it's something you've been engaged with only a little or a lot or never before. This is an entry point for everyone to feel part of having those allies in the work, having support in the work, and a place to learn. This is so important. So thank you to everyone that has joined us, and we hope that you will join us March 3rd. Our guest speaker then will be, my brain is fried, I can't think of her name, but she's with Shared Hope International, and she will be breaking down the Shared Hope report card that was rolled out, and help us understand why we have an F grade along with most every other state in the country in terms of dealing with child sex trafficking. So let's continue to learn, let's continue to advocate and to be open to what we might be able to do to contribute in our spaces. So thank you, everyone, and have a good night. Be safe. We're having a snowstorm in Missouri, so wherever you are out there, everyone be safe. Take care. Thank you,
Take care,
Yvette.
everyone. You're welcome. Take care.
Bye-bye.